Here we are with Chapter 8, Risk Response and Recovery, Part 2, Two Approaches, Quantitative and Qualitative, and then Developing a Strategy. Risk Assessment, a process used to identify and evaluate risks. Risks are quantified based on the importance or impact severity. Risks are prioritized. When a threat exploits a vulnerability, a risk occurs. Threats and vulnerabilities are identified as risks. You need to identify the likelihood that a risk will occur. This can be based on historical data or opinions. For example, imagine a risk occurred an average of 6 times in the past 3 years. If no steps are taken to reduce it, it will probably occur 2 times next year. If the historical data isn't available, experts can provide opinions on the likelihood of it occurring. Identify the asset values. The value of assets helps to determine the impact of the risk. So we talked about a lot of this in part 1. One thing I do want to make a point is that we're going to go through the risk assessment approaches, quantitative and qualitative, and you're actually going to have an assignment on risk assessment, and you will be provided detailed information in terms of how to make the calculations. Of course, some of this is in this particular PowerPoint and recorded lecture as well, but you may receive some more details beyond this particular PowerPoint and recorded lecture. So let's talk about risk assessment approaches. Quantitative is numerically based on hard data and has a financial data objective. It describes the risk in financial terms and puts a dollar value on all the elements of risk. One drawback is that many risks have values that are difficult to measure. What's the value of data to an organization? It's easier to put a value on machines such as workstations and servers than on data. Qualitative is scenario-based or soft data with a scenario-oriented subjective, and it is not objective, it is subjective. There are no dollar values involved. It determines risk level based on probability and the impact of a risk. Here you just describe a risk scenario and then figure out what impact the event would have on business operations. The impact could be in terms of high, medium, or low. It also could be in terms of various different numerical factors, but it would not be based on financial data, so it would not really be objective, it would be subjective. Now, in most situations, you can combine the two methodologies. Qualitative risk analysis gives you a better understanding of the overall impact the disaster will have as the effects ripple through the organization. It may lead to better communication between departments on how they must work together to reduce damage, but it lacks some of the solid financial data of a quantitative risk analysis. So let's talk about quantitative risk assessment. You need to gather data and then enter it into standard formulas. The results can help you identify the priority of risks. You can also use the results to determine the effectiveness of controls. So first you have to calculate the asset value, or AV. An asset is anything of value to an organization from tangible, such as machines and software licenses, to intangible, your reputation. For example, what happened to Target after they got hit? Their reputation went down. Consider the replacement cost of the asset, which it would be hard to replace an intangible asset such as reputation, but accounting firms actually have a category often in balance sheets called goodwill, which is like what customers think of you, and it's kind of a fudgeable number. But in any case, you try and get these numbers to be as specific as possible. Calculate the exposure factor, the percentage of the asset value that will be lost if an incident will occur. As an example, not every car accident is a total loss. Calculate the single loss expectancy, SLE, the total loss expected from one single incident. An incident occurs when a threat exploits a vulnerability. The loss is expressed as a dollar value, such as $10,000. It includes the value of the hardware, the software, and the data. But a single loss expectancy, for example, if one attack on a server will cause it to go down for 24 hours for a whole day, and you know the value of that server to your company on an hourly basis, you can calculate a 24-hour downtime as a single loss expectancy. If you know that the server would be totally destroyed by an attack or by some natural disaster, for example, then you can take the value, the current value or worth of that particular machine and calculate the single loss expectancy of that based on that kind of an incident. It would be different if it was just an attack that would shut the machine down for an hour, as opposed to a flood that would wipe the machine out and cause you to have to replace it and everything on it. So it is going to have a different kind of SLE is going to be different for every kind of incident, even if it's the same asset. You have to calculate the annual rate of occurrence, ARO, the number of times an incident is expected to occur in a year. If an incident occurred once a month in the past year, the ARO is 12, once a month. If it occurs once a week, it's 52. Now, yes, you can calculate 365 divided by 7 and come up with like some odd number like that comes into decimal places. But when you do your assignment, that's not going to be acceptable. What is going to be required is that if I say it happens X number of times a year in terms of weeks, there are 52 weeks in a year. There aren't like 52 point whatever. It's 52 weeks in a year. So the number of times an incident is expected to occur in a year, and if I say it's going to happen 4 times a year, then the ARO would be 4. If I would say it would happen once a week in a year, then the ARO is 52. If it happens once every other year, you divide it by 2. And so the ARO is really, because you're measuring things in terms of a year, the ARO would be a half, 0.5. If it happens once every 10 years, the ARO would be 0.10, 10%. And we measure everything in terms of decimals. When we're trying to make this kind of a calculation. And I want to emphasize the week business again, because all too often when I ask for a number of weeks, in a year, students give me like that decimal answer, and that's not it. There are 52 weeks in a year, period, no matter what you think. And so if it happens multiple times a year, the answer for the ARO is going to be some kind of number greater than 1. If it's every other year or over a period of years, the ARO is going to be less than 1. It's going to be 0.5 or 0.25 or whatever it is. You need to calculate the annual loss expectancy, the expected loss for a year. This is calculated by multiplying SLE times the ARO, because SLE is given in a dollar value, the ALE is given in a dollar value. That's another important thing when you make the calculation. For example, if the SLE is 10,000 and the ARO is 12 once a month, is what that would be, the ALE is $120,000. Now, you also have to multiply this times the exposure factor, because the exposure factor is the percent of the asset. So when you sit there with the asset value, and if the exposure factor, the asset's valued at 100,000 and the exposure value is 20%, then the number you're working with is 20,000, and then you do the other calculations. Lastly, we have what's called the safeguard value. This is the cost of a control. Controls are used to mitigate risk. For example, antivirus software could have an average cost of $50 for each computer. If you had 100 computers, the safeguard value is $5,000. In the end, again, the single loss expectancy times the annual rate of occurrence is the annual loss expectancy. And that's something that you have to remember, except you're also probably going to be required, especially on your assignment, to include the exposure factor into this. So here we have determined the single loss expectancy is the asset value times the exposure factor, and that gives you the real SLE. The annual rate of occurrence, the ARO, is the number of incidents in a year, and the annual loss expectancy is the SLE times the ARO. So consider this example. 100 users in your company use mobile computers. We'll say that they're using laptops. The value of each laptop is $2,000, which includes the cost of the computer, the software, and the data. In the past 2 years, the organization has lost an average of 6 laptops per year. The SLE is 2,000, the value of each computer, the single loss of one of them. The ARO is 6, loss of 6 computers per year, happens 6 times a year. So the annual loss expectancy is $12,000, the single loss times the ARO. Now, obviously, if there was an exposure factor involved in this, then the asset value could change. If the exposure factor was like 20% and the cost of the laptop is 2,000, then the single loss expectancy would be 20% times 2,000, which is $400. Obviously, the actual loss of the entire machine is a 100% loss. You lost it. So the exposure factor would be 1. But there could be situations, again, where it's not a total loss, especially if it's like some kind of disaster where I remember at Great Dane Trailers, we had a flood. We didn't lose the computer, and we really didn't lose any of the data or the programs either, but we lost the availability of it for 3 weeks. And so there would be an exposure factor that could be calculated into that. So getting back to the example that I gave you, someone has suggested purchasing hardware locks for these laptops. Users can use these locks to lock unattended computers to furniture. If you purchase the locks in bulk, they cost $10 each. Additionally, if you purchase and use the locks, you estimate that you can reduce the losses from 6 a year to only 1. Is this cost effective? So the cost of the countermeasure is $1,000, $10 per lock times 100 computers. The new ARO is 1, the new ALE is 2,000. Clearly, this is cost effective because your old ALE was 12,000. Now you're expecting to only lose 2,000. Instead of losing 12,000 per year, you're going to spend 1,000 and only lose 2,000. The total outgoing funds is 3,000, which is much better than the loss of 12,000 you experienced before implementing the new control. On the homework assignment, you'll do a pre-value and a post-value, and you will determine based on that whether quantifiably the cost of the control was worth it. But you'll see that when you get the assignment. Okay, qualitative risk assessment is a little bit different. It relies on the probability, the likelihood that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. The risk occurs when a threat exploits a vulnerability. You can use a scale to define the probability that a risk will occur. The scale can be based on word values such as low, medium, or high. You can then assign percentage values to these words. For example, you could assign a value of 10% to low, and you could assign 100% to high and 50% to medium. Okay, then we have to talk about the impact. The negative result of a risk occurs. Impact is used to identify the magnitude of the risk. The risk results in some type of loss. However, instead of quantifying the loss as a dollar amount, an impact assessment could use words such as low, medium, or high. You may also use these categories to identify probabilities. However, where a probability is expressed as a percentage, the impact is expressed as a relative value. For example, low could be 10, medium could be 50, and high could be 100. So the risk level is equal to the probability times the impact. Okay, then we have to talk about developing a strategy. So there are 4 strategies. The first is risk mitigation or reduction. This approach uses various controls to mitigate or reduce identified risks. They may be administrative, technical, or physical. Then we have risk assignment, transference. This allows the organization to transfer the risk to another entity. Transference, insurance is a common way to transfer the risk to another entity. Another way is to outsource your information security efforts to a consulting firm that will either create a system for you and you run it, or create and run it for you. This is especially useful if your organization does not have a lot of trained security personnel. Risk acceptance. This allows the organization to just accept the risk. The organization knows the risk exists and has decided the cost of reducing it is greater than the loss would be. Acceptance can include self-insuring or using a deductible. The level of risk an organization is willing to accept depends on what we call the risk appetite of senior management. For example, a doctor buys malpractice insurance and accepts the residual risk of loss equal to the deductible. He can decide to pay an even higher premium to reduce the deductible, but it might not be worth the cost because he would rarely need to make a claim. We do that with our cars too. Risk avoidance, deciding not to take a risk. A company can continue to decide not to enter a line of business if the risk level is too high. Now, I want to point out that when we talk about these four strategies, which are listed on page 263 of our text, these are strategies, as you see on this slide, for avoiding, either reducing, transferring, accepting, and avoiding each negative risk. Down at the bottom of the page, it talks about positive risks. You can exploit, share, enhance, or accept each risk. For example, in exploitation, when you exploit a positive risk, you take advantage of an opportunity that arises when you respond to that risk. For example, suppose your organization developed training materials for use within your organization to help you address a specific risk. You might exploit this by packaging and marketing those training materials to other organizations. And then sharing. When you share a positive risk, you use a third party to help capture the opportunity associated with that risk. For example, banding with another organization to purchase a group of workstation licenses enables both organizations to realize a substantial discount. Enhancing is another positive. When you enhance a positive risk, you increase the probability or positive impact of the event associated with that risk. For example, suppose you have a contract to deliver software that includes a $20,000 bonus for early completion. To enhance that, a delivery date that does not match your schedule, you might offer a subcontractor you've hired a $5,000 bonus for finishing ahead of the deadline. And lastly, acceptance of a positive risk. You take no steps to address it because the potential effects of the risk are positive and add value. For example, suppose you have purchased a new automated backup and configuration utility that can help your organization deploy new workstations in half the allotted time. Because it's new, it might take some time to learn, meaning it may not help your organization save any time deploying new workstations. It's determined that at worst, learning the new utility and using it to manage deployments will take the same amount of time as doing it manually, but if you realize the positive risk, you'll finish the deployments sooner than planned. Now, the four on this slide, again, are affecting negative risks. And even though the book does discuss positive risks, when it comes down to your tests or even the assignment, we're talking about these four strategies here for negative risks. So, acceptable range of risk, of residual risk. You have to define the activities and countermeasures. The upper bound is risk impact, and the cost would be too great for the organization to bear. The lower bound shows the increased cost of the countermeasures to handle the residual risk. An example of applying countermeasures: car insurance. If you purchase a brand new car, it loses value as soon as you drive it off the dealer's lot because it's now used. If an accident totals the car, insurance may not pay the price you paid for the car. The difference between what the insurance company pays and what you actually paid for the car is the residual risk. Threats, vulnerabilities, and asset value make up a risk. The total risk is the combined risk to all the business assets. The residual risk is the risk that remains after you've installed countermeasures and controls. Now, applying those countermeasures and controls reduces the risk but doesn't eliminate it. And you may not choose to eliminate risk entirely because doing so is impossible or too expensive. When you do not reduce risk, that risk remains as residual risk, as in the insurance example. Risk minus the mitigating controls equals the residual risk when you talk in terms of dollar values. So let's talk about evaluating countermeasures. Control, safeguard, and countermeasures are not interchangeable terms. Control limits or constrains value. Safeguards and countermeasures are controls that exercise restraint on or management of some activity. There are an unlimited number of possible countermeasures. A countermeasure must have a clearly defined purpose. Some specific purposes of countermeasures include fix known exploitable software flaws, develop and enforce operational procedures and access controls, provide encryption capability, improve physical security, disconnect unreliable networks. An example of controls, safeguards, or countermeasures. A safe for storage of valuables is a control. A guard to watch the safe is a safeguard. The insurance against the loss of the valuables if stolen is a countermeasure. Security responsibilities. Everyone needs to be aware of his or her security responsibilities. Security will be a full-time job for some people, but not all people. Some specific security responsibilities you may hold include delete redundant guest accounts, train system administrators, specific training, train everybody, general training, install virus scanning software, install IDS, IPS, and network scanning tools. Pricing or costing a countermeasure. Several factors that need to be considered when evaluating countermeasures. The product cost. The price includes the base price, the price of additional features, and costs associated with the service level agreement, the SLA, or annual maintenance. Implementation costs. Costs associated with changes to the infrastructure, construction, design, and training, such as reinforcing a floor. Compatibility cost. Countermeasures must fit within an overall structure. An example of this is a Windows-only organization would have to carefully consider the additional costs associated with training and interoperability when installing a Linux-based countermeasure. Environmental cost. If countermeasures use a lot of energy, you would need to consider if your electric system would be able to provide it. Testing costs. Testing the system. Productivity impact. What effect will the control have on productivity? For example, will it generate more calls to the help desk? Countermeasure evaluation. First, you need to ask, what problem is the countermeasure designed to solve? Then you have to ask, does this countermeasure solve the problem? Other points to consider include countermeasures might pose a new risk to the organization. For example, implementing a countermeasure may create a false sense of security, or the countermeasure itself might become a new point of failure on a critical system. You must perform certification and accreditation of the countermeasure programs. No system, control, or application should go into production without first going through a change control process, which we already discussed in Chapter 6. You must follow best practices and exercise due diligence. Due diligence, a good risk management program, tells auditors the company is taking a prudent and diligent approach to security risks. Due diligence is exercised by frequently evaluating whether countermeasures are performing as expected. Let's talk quickly about controls and their place in the security life cycle. Controls that manage the activity phase of security, the things people do, are administrative controls. They develop and ensure compliance with policy and procedures. A control carried out or managed by a computer system is a technical control. Controls correspond to the life cycle of a security program are as follows. Detective controls. These identify that a threat has landed in your system. An example would be an IDS, which can detect attacks on systems such as port scans. Preventive controls. These stop threats from coming in contact with a vulnerability. An example would be an intrusion prevention system, an IPS. This is an IDS that is configured to actively block an attack instead of just logging the activity. And finally, corrective controls. Reduce the effects of a threat. An example is when you reload an operating system after it's infected with malware. So this is the end of part 2. Part 3 will contain planning to survive, developing a business impact analysis, developing a business continuity plan, and developing a disaster recovery